Spiritual Christianity. Chapter 5 continued. Point number 92. The metamorphosis of plants in the spiritual world into the correlative animals, and from these into human forms, by the approximation of spheres, or by transitions in the relationship of minds from external affinities of various kinds to internal, is a subject replete with the most instructive truths. In the memorable relations of Swedenborg, many facts are set forth which illustrate the law of spiritual approximations, and he who is familiar with his writings needs only to be reminded that these instances which he gives are not exceptions to the general law of creation in the spiritual world, but strictly come within it. To others who may not be versed in the spiritual philosophy of his theological writings, a few examples may be usefully selected to assist them in obtaining clear and well-boundaried views of a subject which is not difficult in itself, being on the contrary as clear as it is convincing, but which may be rendered so by the delusive phantoms which our natural minds are in the habit of pursuing. In his work upon married love, he says that on several occasions, when the interior states of his mind or spirit were opened, and he in consequence was associated, both as to his mind and as to his sensuous faculties, with angels in the spiritual world, he was permitted to see and converse with those who lived in those ages which derived their names from the four metals: gold, silver, copper, and iron. In a relation which describes the interior state, more especially in respect to married love, as well as the exterior life of those who belonged to the Silver Age, he says, "I was in the spirit and accompanied by my heavenly guide, and first we came to a hill on the confines between the east and the south, and while we were on its ascent, he pointed out to me a widely extended tract of country, and we saw in the distance a mountain range. Between this and the hill on which we stood there was a valley, and from this a gently rising ascent. We descended the hill in order to pass through the valley, and there we beheld on each side figures of men and women carved in wood and stone, and also the figures of various beasts, birds, and fishes. Upon inquiring of the angel what these meant and whether they were idols, 'By no means,' he replied. 'They are the representative configurations of various moral virtues and of spiritual truths. The people of the Silver Age, possess the knowledge of correspondences, and because every man, beast, bird, and fish corresponds to some specific mental quality, therefore every graven image represents some particular belonging to virtue or truth itself, in a common, enlarged, or comprehensive form. Such as these in Egypt are called the hieroglyphics. We passed through the valley, and as we were entering upon the plain, horses and chariots appeared to us, the horses with harnesses and trappings of various kinds, and the chariots carved into different forms, some like eagles and whales, some like antlered stags, and some like unicorns. At a greater distance there were some carts, and around these at the sides there were stables. But as we approached them, the horses, as well as the chariots, disappeared, and instead of them we saw men and women in pairs, walking and conversing, reasoning together." And that was from Married Love number 76, or Conjugal Love 76. In his work on True Christian Religion, he states that in the spiritual world he once saw two flocks, one of goats and the other of sheep. "I wondered," he says, "who they were, for I knew that the animals seen in the spiritual world were not animals, but correspondences of the affections and of the thoughts, which they are of their effects, flowing forth from those who are there." And that was from True Christian Religion 506. Point number 93. By relations such as these, and there are several of a like kind to be found in other parts of his works, will the universal truth gain by degrees full possession of the mind, and we shall be convinced that the spiritual world having no actual externity of space, must consist in all its sensuous objects of appearances, which represent, because they correspond to, the states of the spiritual affinity which produce them. Angels, therefore, whenever they behold or touch or are sensuously conscious of the presence of animals and plants, are able, by the divine light within their minds, to perceive intuitively that those objects and their changes are effects, which representatively embody the distances of mental states and the relative changes in spheres of life. In this way is their sensuous world understood by them, every object of the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms being a reflected image of the Lord's kingdom of love and wisdom, of good and of truth, in which they read the multifold uses that are involved in the harmonious interchange of thoughts and of affections. And yet, though these sensuous objects are but appearances, the creation of the divine life by the medium of imperfect forms of mind, there is no difference whatever between the manner of their appearance and that of the sensuous objects of the natural world. They as much appear to be distinct from the mind and to exist beyond the circumference of the body. They have all the characteristics of externity which belong to the objects of the natural world, and they are even more distinctly obvious to all the senses. To the sensuous faculties of sight and hearing, they appear as if transmitted through an intervening space, just as sounds and the objects of sight appear to be transmitted in the natural world. To the sensuous faculties of smell and taste, they are presented as in the natural world, under the appearance of odours and flavours in countless variety. To the sensuous faculty of touch, they appear, as in the natural world, to offer a resistance and to be felt as hard or soft, smooth or rough, plain or curved, warm or cold, in a succession of endless variety. And all these, as they perceive the causes, so do they understand their meanings. Point number 94. The intricacies of the path are now to a considerable extent surmounted, and the constitution of spiritual space and time, with the mode in which the appearance of sensuous objects are generated, may so far be understood as to not be confounded with natural space and time, nor with the mode in which the images or objects of the senses are supposed to be conveyed to the brain. A few steps further onward, and the rational perception, it is to be hoped, will be complete, and the mind will be able to intuitively see that the actual extension of space and the actual progression of time, both extraneous to the sentient being, on the reality of which man builds so much, are not at all necessary for their complete realization to the sensuous faculties, but are, on the contrary, useless appendages which in truth could serve no purpose whatever in the spiritual world, and which do serve no other purpose in the natural world than as hypothetical phantoms, the truth of which the natural man is accustomed to demonstrate, in a way quite satisfactory to himself, by an appeal to a number of other delusions of precisely similar kind. But it is now time to revert to the passages on which the perception of spiritual truth must rest, and without which no clear insight can be gained into the generation of spiritual space and time, and into the grounds or reason for the science of correspondences. By reviewing these passages as they are arranged in the preceding pages, and by directing the attention to the primary truths which they contain, the clue will be found to guide us safely through the deep tangled intellectual forests by which the paradise of wisdom is surrounded, and to keep our minds ever after from straying into those dark, delusive paths out of which so few in this world are found willing to emerge. Point number 95. First, let us bear in mind, and never, if possible, lose sight of the truth that the Lord God is omnipresent and is not in space. His being, therefore, is not of a spatial kind. In other words, he does not fill space as natural bodies are supposed to fill it. The conclusion which the author draws from this prime truth of reason is that space in the spiritual world, though it has an internal reality in the ground of the angelic state, has no such external reality as our natural ways of thinking lead us to suppose that it must have in the natural world. For had it such an actuality, the Lord could not be present in that world without being present in its space. But the omnipresence of his divine life sustains all creation in existence. It follows, therefore, that space in the spiritual world cannot have the external reality which it is supposed to have in this. But if it had no external reality and yet bear the semblance of externity, it can be but a phenomenon or appearance only. This appearance of an actual space is created by means of the imperfect conjunction of the angelic mind with the Lord, and is the representative image of such imperfection. For an angel cannot be conjoined to the Lord such as he is in himself. In other words, his mind is finitely or imperfectly receptive of the divine life, and this indeed forms the ground of a conscience distinct from that of the Creator. And as, by the law of his creation, he can only be imperfectly cojoined to the Lord, this imperfect conjunction of the mind, when it comes into the representative plane of the senses, is exhibited to angels under the appearance as if they were an intervening space between the Lord and themselves. On this account, he appears to them as a son, at a spatial distance from them, just as a natural son appears to be at a distance from man. Thus does their distance, as to the state of mind, from the Lord, give birth to the sensuous appearance of his distance from them in space. This is the origin of the appearance to angels of an intervening space between the Lord and themselves, and this is the reason for the appearance. But being an effect of their imperfect conjunction with him, and not of his infinite presence with them, it follows that he cannot to himself be in the appearance of space, still less in any actual space, although it might seem to uninstructed minds who know not what space is, nor how the appearance is created, as if he were in both. He has no actual space before him, as a natural man has, nor yet the appearance of space as a spiritual man has, for both the one and the other are the representative images or effects of the finite state of their minds, and mark, by the different ways in which space and the objects of space are considered and interpreted in the two sensuous worlds, the differences between the spiritual mind and the natural. Point number 96. All the appearances of spatial distance in heaven depend as effects upon this universal law of spiritual existence, that every angel is, as to his mind, a form that receives the divine love and wisdom after a finite or imperfect manner, and cannot therefore be conjoined to the Lord such as he is in himself. This is the essential condition of their minds, and this condition is sensually represented to them by the distance at which their spiritual son seems placed. This position of the spiritual son in a distant portion of space is an appearance, and nothing more than an appearance, as are all the objects which the sensuous faculties of themselves would judge to be at different distances from the sentient being. For in that world, or in that state of life, they know by the divine light of truth that the Lord is omnipresent in heaven, and that being omnipresent, there can be no actual space, nor any bodies in space. And this truth being perceived and understood, the conclusion necessarily follows that the image of a son existing in space is an appearance only, the divine cause of which is within them, and that the sensuous Son of Heaven signifies, or is the representative sign, in the manner of its appearance, of the imperfect reception of the divine love by the percipient angel. And there is a little asterisk footnote here that says, for the creation of a being who shall, in a possession of a conscience distinct from the Creator, or who shall have a distinct personality, that being must finitely or imperfectly receive the life of love and wisdom, which in its essence is infinitely or perfectly given. Infinite or perfect reception is not possible where there is a distinct individual consciousness, for such reception would be an identification. Therefore, a God from a God is not possible, if both are assumed to be infinite. And therefore, with such assumption, there cannot be more gods than one. Point number 97. The objects in the representative space of heaven are declared to be altogether like the objects which are presented to the senses in the natural world. Externally, there is no difference between them. Angels, like natural men, appear both to themselves and to their companions as if, one while they were moving about in an external space, or occupying, while at rest, a certain portion of space. To the senses, their bodies seem to approach one another or to recede by moving through space, and yet there is no actual space surrounding them. There are no actual bodies, in the natural meaning of the word, to change their positions in space. The whole is a representative appearance of the relationships of minds to one another and of certain changes in those relationships. All angels have a like appearance of space presented to them, because their minds are similarly constituted as to their imperfect reception of the divine life. But as everyone has a mind peculiarly constituted, and yet one that harmonizes and communicates by the affinity of use with other minds, therefore, according to these internal relationships, they appear to one another externally or representatively at various relative distances. These phenomena distances are not such as are the distances of the natural world. For in the former world they are perceived no otherwise than as the exponents of space, representing their various receptivities of the Lord's divine life, and the various affinities in which subordinately they stand to one another. Whereas in our state of life, space and distance in space, the natural mind separates from their spiritual causes, and as it does not comprehend the light that comes down from heaven, it understands not how time and space can be the outbursts of thought, and except by the same light of an interior perception, can see nothing of correspondence between the world of human minds and those changes and outward objects which constitute the events of human life. For in the former world they are perceived no otherwise than as the exponents of state, representing their various receptivities of the Lord's divine life, and the various affinities in which subordinately they stand to one another. Whereas in our state of life, space, and the distance in space, the natural mind separates from their spiritual causes, and, as it does, quote, not comprehend the light that comes down from heaven, end quote, it understands not how time and space can be outbursts of the thought, and except by the same light of an interior perception, can see nothing of correspondence between the world of human minds and those changes and outward objects which constitute the events of human life. Point number 98. In this, then, intellectually considered, consist the differences between the spiritual and the natural mind, and in this, therefore, consist the differences between the space of the two worlds, or between the ways in which space is perceived in these two states of life. Outwardly they are the same, but internally, or in the perception of angels and of men, they are entirely different. This dissimilitude between spiritual thought and natural is explained by reference to the fact that the natural man has matter, space, time, and quantity for subjects of thinking, as well as for objects, whereas the spiritual man has those properties for objects only and not for subjects about which the mind thinks when sensuous objects are presented to it. Now, the subjects with an angel are the interior causes of every sensuous object which is presented to their mind, and about these causes he thinks when he is said to think above space. On the contrary, the natural man, having the same things, both for subjects and for objects, invariably thinks in space, and therefore falsely, for he thinks the subject in the object, and reverses the order of influx by attributing to sensations causes external to the mind that perceives them. In the one, there is an intuitive perception of these spiritual or mental causes, which there is not in the other. The spiritual man or angel perceives their signification, just as a man understands at once the meaning of articulate sounds when he hears a language with which he is familiar, for he thinks above the sounds and not in them. But the natural man sees sensuous objects just in the same way as he hears the words of a language which he understands not. Not understanding their meaning, his mind rests in the mere sounds. He may amuse himself with their harmonies and dissonances, their singular collocations, and hundreds other trifles connected with the meaningless sounds which come to him, as he supposes, from without, and all this because, not being acquainted with the correspondence between the sounds and the thoughts of the speaker, he thinks in the sounds themselves and not above them.